What's going down? Thank you so much for your patience. Apologize for being on 2 minutes late, but excited to have the opportunity to chat with you, with my bride. We want to talk about healing trauma. Now, you might ask, what is trauma? Well, we're going to talk about that, but something important to understand as it relates to trauma is this: unprocessed trauma can show up in the most unusual ways. Unprocessed trauma can show up as exhaustion in our life. It can show up as irritability, as anger, because what happens is in our life, a traumatic event can come upon us unexpectedly. And as a result, the pain that we're left with, we can split off from that trauma, not deal with that trauma, not address that trauma. And if we don't address that trauma, if we leave it unprocessed, so to speak, and we split off from it, what can happen is that trauma stays trapped in our body, so to speak. And then it shows its ugly head in other ways, and we might not recognize that the root of our irritability is unprocessed trauma, that the root of our exhaustion is unprocessed trauma, that the root of our anger and our bitterness and our dysfunction and our addictions and different things can go back to trauma that needs to be addressed. And so that's why it's important for us to take a look at it. There was a time as it relates to trauma that people thought, oh, this is something like post-traumatic stress syndrome, is something that only people coming back from war have. But now with MRIs and CT scans, we can literally look and study the brain, and you can see how trauma can impact the brain and literally create damage and create dysfunction. And thankfully, what we're learning through some neuroscience today is there's hope through neuroplasticity. There's ways that we can go in, deal with the trauma. So here's what I want to say at the outset. If you're struggling from something traumatic in your life, if you're struggling from something that is unprocessed, that needs to be dealt with, face it, address it, deal with it. And that's what my wife and I want to help talk about with you today. A few weeks ago, my wife and I were traveling, and I found myself feeling irritable. And I remember telling her, I said, I feel really irritable lately. And I said, I think it's just unprocessed trauma. I was in a place that was reminding me of something very traumatic in our life. And I found myself feeling traumatized by it, and I was being irritable. I was being on edge. And what it showed me is, wow, there's still more healing to go. And so we are not here as people who have it all figured out. We're trying to heal trauma ourselves, and we just want to invite you into the journey. So, Hun, talk to us a little bit about what trauma is.
Yeah, well, hello. Glad to be here. Had some technical difficulties.
Yes, we did.
But here we are. So trauma is just, first of all, I'm just really excited we're talking about trauma, not because I'm excited about trauma, but I'm excited to bring who is,
right.
But I'm excited to bring it to light, because I think we really underestimate what trauma can really do to our body as a whole. And when I think about Christianity and Christian circles we run in, churches, Bible studies, women's groups, everything, we don't discuss these traumatic events. We don't discuss these mental health issues that we've been trying to tackle. And so I think it's so important that we start bringing these things, and these become just mainstay conversations. We do these, this is what we do. We talk about this. There's no shame in this. There's no guilt in this. And the same rings true with trauma. So I'm so excited to be talking about trauma. But when you think about the word trauma, it's actually a Greek word, and the Greek word means injury. And that's a very appropriate word when you think about that. Injury to the body, to the mind, or to the spirit. So we have traumatic events that happen to us all the time. It's going to happen. It's not a matter of if, but when, because we're going to have trauma that happens in our life. I know we have, and the more trauma you have, the more you have to deal with, right? Because it's not fun when you have traumatic events. So it's just things we have to deal with. And we're going to be talking about types of trauma. We're going to talk about ways to heal trauma from a holistic perspective. But at the end of the day, we're all going to experience trauma, and it's going to come in the form of maybe a midlife crisis, maybe financial stress, maybe a death of a loved one, a divorce, job loss. These are all traumatic events. It doesn't have to be like what Bobby said, going to war, or, always a death of someone that you always would put in that category of trauma. But it can be little things too. And if you're an empath like I am, and like Bobby is, some things are more traumatic than they probably should be to our emotions. So because we feel things deeply, and so I'm really excited to dig into this because it's very layered and textured when you talk about something like trauma. So I'm hoping we can just bring some insight and wisdom to it.
I'm glad that you brought up empath at the beginning, because some people, their emotions are more lively than others, right? There are people that are emotionally muted. They don't feel as much, but then there's people who, like, their life motto is, oh my gosh, I'm freaking out. Like, I always just feel like I'm freaking out, like life's coming, off the edge.
I live in freak out mode.
I live in freak out mode. Like I've said many times, like, I always kind of feel like it's my job to offer my contribution to world worry on a daily basis, right? Like, so if you're somebody that is got a lively emotional base, it could be because you're an empath. And as a result, you're more susceptible then to being traumatized, relationally traumatized. And so there's different types of trauma that you can go through. I mean, natural events, for example, natural tragedies, I should say. If you go through like the tsunami that they went through, as we know, like in Indonesia, or like right now, this has been a traumatic event. It can be a corporate trauma that we experience. Like, I think our nation is experiencing some corporate trauma, right? It can be individual trauma. And the trauma is stuff that if it's not dealt with, it's going to come out. And you can even think about what's happening in our culture right now, and all the confusion and the anger and the frustration. There's stuff that has been buried that needs to be dealt with, and hopefully we can figure out a way, God willing, to unify things. But ultimately, we want to be integrated as individuals, and it's hard to be integrated if we don't deal with this. So it could be natural disasters. It could be the sudden loss of a loved one. It can be a relational trauma, like a divorce. It could be trauma through abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, repeated abuse. Sometimes it's trauma that is more, like one event that somebody's really struggling to get through, but then it can be very multi-layered. Sometimes people have multiple traumas, right? Like they've been through the loss of a loved one, they've been physically beaten, maybe they've been raped, and all of this begins to stack up and add up. And when people are struggling with that amount of pain and they don't know how to process it, they get stuck. And what do we do when we're hurting? We look for reprieve. But then what can happen is that can lead us into things like addiction and other things where we seek to assuage it in the wrong ways.
Yes, for sure. And trauma, if you don't treat it, so what we're going to do next is go over some signs of untreated and unprocessed trauma. Because if you're watching, maybe you have some things going on and you're like, wow, I didn't even know that is the result of trauma in my life. And like Bobby said, honestly, all of us are experiencing trauma right now. What we've just been through, we're still in it. Like, a pandemic, and I don't even know. Like, it's just a lot, right? So you are experiencing trauma, but you may not realize what it's doing to your mind, to your body, and to your spirit. So we're going to go through a few things of what it looks like if you have some unprocessed trauma, untreated trauma. Mm-hmm. And the first thing would be chronic physical and mental health issues. So there again, we need to look at it from a holistic perspective, that trauma hurts us on all levels. And what that can look like, it can be heart disease, It could be cancer, high blood pressure, autoimmune disease, chronic fatigue syndrome. This is very common. I have so many women that DM me all the time, and they're like, I'm just so tired. I'm on edge all the time. I have brain fog. And when I dig deep, people come to me, oh, I want help on nutrition. But when you start digging behind it, you realize that their life has been full of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll get into this later, but these are some physical signs: chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, their body hurts all the time and they don't know why. This is so common, but yet doctors don't know what to do with it besides throw a drug at it. But sometimes it's trauma that has initiated this in your life. Depression and anxiety. And then we also see that people that have unprocessed trauma, they have smaller brains. There's a lot of brain shrinkage actually that comes especially to the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And that's been significant. Dr. Amen has done a lot of work around that and shown that traumatic events really does shrink your brain. So, that's not good. We want to heal our brain. We want to be whole, right? It shows you have memory problems. You're more vulnerable to addiction. You're unable to emotionally regulate yourself when you're dealing with a lot of trauma. And I've known a lot of these things to be true even in my life when I've had just a lot coming at me. It's just like, I cannot take one more thing, right? It's just too much right now. So that's one sign. You have chronic physical and mental health issues. That's the first one. Because what happens is our nervous system gets dysregulated and it doesn't know how to properly put things where they go. Like, picture our body trying to process things. It just gets dysregulated. It's hijacked. And then our body stores these traumatic events in our body. Like it's kind of like a memory our body holds on to until we heal it and release it. So those are some physical.
Yeah, it makes me
signs.
think of a book that I just read this past week by DeGroat called Wholeheartedness, and he's a counselor. And one of the interesting insights is he was sharing about how one particular person had shared that many people think that the secret to dealing with exhaustion is rest. And that's what you think. I'm exhausted. I need rest. Yet what this individual so keenly pointed out is sometimes, right? But what we really need when we're exhausted is wholeheartedness. In other words, we need a healthy heart. We need to be integrated. And so many people, as they go on in their careers or they go on in their marriage, they get worn down by the trauma of a difficult marriage, by the trauma of parenting kids that were difficult, by the trauma of occupational difficulties. And what happens is you start burning out, you start getting exhausted, and then you start longing for rest. And while rest can be good, the antidote might not be in the rest. It might be in getting an integrated whole heart, getting healthy again, because the thing getting in the way of that whole heart is the unprocessed trauma. I'm not dealing with this trauma, but the traumas are burning me out on life.
So often we want to numb out of life, right? We're like, we just need to go sit on an island with a drink in my hand, right? That's how we're going to cope. But really what we need to do with that wholeheartedness is lean into it. Lean into the pain, lean into it, let it surface, let it come up. And we're going to be talking about some of that. But I think that's so good, living that wholehearted life. That's really what John 10:10 is, right? Living that abundant life, because God wants us to live that abundant life. That's why he's created us, so that we can spread his word and his love. And if we're bogged down with trauma and stress and pain, then we're not able to do that. So another sign that you have some unprocessed trauma is having like panic attacks and fear for no reason. Just irrational fears, irrational panics, and they kind of like hit you out of nowhere. Like you don't even know where it came from. That racing heartbeat, kind of like that anxiety feeling, but it's like you find that happening a lot in your life. Another one is getting caught in a cycle of toxic relationships and self-sabotage. So I've known so many people through our years of ministry, whether it's through whatever they're going through, I've noticed that they keep repeating those same patterns. I know we have repeated our same patterns throughout our life. And it's like, why do we keep getting on this hamster wheel and doing the same thing over and over? But that's just what we do because we're insane, right? Speak for yourself. Is that what you're saying?
Michael the Great Prince says, "Amen, sister."
Yeah, that's right.
By the way, as my wife's talking, feel free to fill up. Let us know where you're from, where you're listening from. We just thank you for paying attention to our ministry. We want to continue to bring messages like this to you. And if you got questions, we'll be glad to answer those at the end of this discussion.
Yeah, bring on the comments and tell us where you are and all that stuff. So anyway, so just that cycle of toxic relationships and self-sabotage. I know a lot of people just start self-destructing because they don't really know what else to do. They feel like they need to do something, so they just self-destruct. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but that's what we do as humans. And another sign that you have some untreated or unprocessed trauma is that you find yourself being very resistant. And that's, you could be like, what do you mean you're resistant? But that you just find yourself feeling stuck all the time, right? Like you can't seem to move forward in whatever you're wanting to do. You procrastinate, you have a lack of motivation. And even like when you put in boundaries and schedules for yourself, that you still have a very hard time keeping up with that. Even when you set yourself up to win, you still find that you can't, and that's another big sign that you have some unprocessed trauma. So at this point, I think it's safe to say that we all have some unprocessed trauma. Another one is that, and this is what I see in my practice a lot with my clients, is that even though you're eating healthy, you're exercising, you're doing everything that you know to do, maybe you've even been to a doctor or holistic health coach like myself, and everything's right. You're doing everything right, but yet you're still unwell. So that is a big sign of that something, that your body is holding on to trauma, that you're not processing the trauma, because from the outside, everything looks great. Even on the inside, things look great as far as your numbers and stuff. But for whatever reason, you're still unwell. And we've all known these people that, like, no matter what I do, something's always wrong. So we're going to get into why that is here in a little while. But those are 4 or 5 things that I think that we could tap into as far as unprocessed trauma, what that could look like.
Yeah, I do want to say again that my wife has been doing some counseling, a lot of nutrition and holistic counseling. So feel free to recognize her Instagram handle there. She can really help. I'm thankful for all the people who've already been reaching out. She's been getting some appointments and clients, and I'm sure that if you'll reach out to her via Instagram, or you can reach out to her via Facebook.
And we used to have an email slide, but I don't know if we still do. We can look for it as we're talking
we can
here.
Look for it.
I mean, feel free to email me too, or call, whatever. If you can find me, just reach out. I am happy to help. And
exactly.
That's what I want to do. I want to serve people and help people feel better, because this life is hard sometimes, and we just need a little assistance as we move on.
Yeah. So be sure to check her out on that. Some of the places in Scripture, do you want to talk about that now? I'm going to share some stuff on that. So I think we think of trauma, and it can sound kind of like, all right, neuroscience or counseling or 21st century-esque. But if you really think about it, I mean, life's filled with trauma, and you would expect to find it in the Scriptures. You want some examples of trauma? Well, let's think of some. David is a good example. Read the Psalms. You can see how he experienced so much trauma in his life. I mean, imagine King Saul chucking a spear at him on 2 different occasions, trying to kill him. He was running from his life. His son, it was grotesque what his son did to him and what happened there. David was a person who understood lots of pain. But what we see is in the Psalms is we see the poet, king, processing his trauma through prayer, through trust, through dependence in God. Another example of trauma, I mean, think about Job. I mean, can you imagine the trauma he went through when he first found out about all of his loss? He basically, shaves his head, strips down, says, "Naked I came into the world, naked I shall leave." And we think, wow, hail Job. I mean, look at the way he responds right here. Like, look at his faith. But when you keep reading in the story, you realize that once the shock passed, once the pain, once the trauma set in of what happened, he was traumatized. He could not understand. And that's another thing that trauma will do. It will bring you into existential angst in your relationship with God, because the trauma is so painful. And you'll find yourself thinking, God, if you're God, if you're there, then do something. Why leave me sitting in this trauma, in this pain? If you want another example of trauma, you think about Hagar. We know that Hagar was picked up in Egypt by Abraham and Sarah. And basically, they were waiting for their promised child to come. And when the promised child had not come, Sarah says, "I've got this bright idea. Why don't you go into our maidservant, Hagar, and then we'll kind of help God out, bring the process about of the promised child." Well, then you know what happens. Ishmael is born. Well, we can understand the difficulty in waiting on God for Isaac, but they tried to resolve this themselves. And then Sarah gets resentful and she says, "Send Hagar away." Now Hagar goes off with Ishmael and all that rejection that she would experience, leaving. And thankfully, God meets her to comfort her in the midst of her trauma. I think the approach that we are looking for when it comes to trauma is Jesus gives a great example in the parable of the Good Samaritan. We know that, Jesus tells this parable of a person traveling on their way from Jordan down to Jericho or whatever. And then as a result, what happens is this person is beaten, ripped off, his stuff is stolen, and there he's just laying in a ditch. And the religious leaders pass by this person who's been traumatized. But then what happens? A good Samaritan, a person who's not even a believer, just a person who's been created in the image of God, who has some good decency to recognize trauma. And what does this person do? This person comforts this person. This person has compassion on the person who was beaten. This person helps heal the wounds. And what a beautiful picture of kind of the way that we are to assist people in the midst of their despair and trauma. And so those are some biblical examples. That's just one illustration of Jesus and how he cares. All right, that's God's heart for those who are traumatized. And it doesn't even take a believer to recognize when someone's traumatized to step in and intervene. Sometimes it's the religious people that add more trauma to the trauma that's already there. Case in point, in the story of this parable of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah, it's really good. So good. And so I think that kind of leads us back to maybe how we experience trauma, right? So what does our body physiologically do when we experience trauma? How did God design it? Because he has given us tools to fight that trauma. So when you think about the way our body was designed and we have a traumatic experience come into our life, God has designed our body to either fight, flight, or freeze. Mm-hmm. Those are the instincts that God has given us. Mm-hmm. We either fight, flight, or freeze. And those are God designed. So what do we do? And we all know, and it's really important to know what your style is. And I had even written some stuff down. I was going to go into it, but I don't know that we really have the time to do that. But it is very important to know what your survival style is, because we typically come at traumatic events with one of those things, right? So are you a fighter? Do you get more aggressive? Do you just get the heck out of Dodge? Like, I'm just leaving this whole state and going somewhere else? Or do you just freeze and get paralyzed? So kind of really doing that work on figuring out which
and
one
I would
it
even
is.
add maybe a fourth one, because you remember when we did the family life marriage conferences all those years, I'd talk about there's three types of way we deal with conflict. You have the duke it out, you have the fake it out, and you have the hide it out. Well, you can see the duke it out there, right? Fight. You can see the, you had to duke it out, the fake it out, the hide it out. So you can see the flee, the hide it out. But what you don't see is the fake it out. So sometimes this talks about freezing, and we'll freeze, but sometimes we'll even fake it. Like, I'm fine. And we act like we've got it in control.
Well, we're going to talk about that, because you can only do that for so long. That's because you cannot trick your body. It's going to come back at some point. Mm-hmm. And when you think about those 3 instincts that God has given us by design, they're really only meant, that fight, flight, or freeze, are really only meant for a short period of time. We're not meant to live in that fight, flight, or freeze state constantly. And so when you're living in those states constantly, I call them those survival instincts, it really causes a lot of problems, because that's not the way God has designed our body. But yet that's what we do, because this is how we've learned to cope with life, is we fight, we freeze, or we flee. And so we need to learn these good coping skills, because over time, if you do it, it builds up. And the thing about trauma, and I think this is a very important thing, is it's cumulative. And what do I mean by that is it's cumulative in the way our body holds onto it, the way our mind holds onto it, and our soul can hold onto it too. Because if we don't deal with it, we just stuff it down, it accumulates, right? And then eventually there is a tipping point, and it's going to come out one way or the other, in a health crisis, addiction, midlife crisis. Something's going to happen. And I read a book, or an illustration, is you could have the same 2 people go through like a minor car accident, just a minor fender bender, right? And one person will be like, oh, I had a fender bender. That, sucks. I had a fender bender, but they can go about their day. They can call the insurance. They can just, do what they need to do and go about their life. The other person had the exact same fender bender. That could send them literally over the edge, because they cannot handle any more cumulative stress. They have had too much fight, flight, and freeze responses in their life. And this is it. This tipped them over. And you're like, well, gosh, it was just a fender bender. Well, no, it wasn't a fender bender. Yeah. That's what it looked like.
The iceberg.
Yeah. So that's really what's going on. So you can't long-term live in these hypersensitive states. It's called your autonomic system. You can't live like that long-term without causing great stress, internal stress to our body, and trauma to our body.
Yeah. When you think about some of this fight, flight, or freeze, we kind of all have our tendencies for how we best cope. And for me, mine would be flight. Like, when I'm in pain, I want to escape. That's what I do. Escape to alcohol, escape to whatever, just a new reality. That can be like my temptation, right? We all have to be aware of our temptations to anesthetize ourselves, to not really deal with the pain. But you want a good example of flight? Think of trauma. Noah gets off the ark. He's traumatized. I mean, just civilization, right, is just wiped out. And what does he do? Well, flight into inebriation. He goes, right? You think like God spares Noah and his wife and the family, right? So 8 people are spared. Everyone else is wiped out because of debauchery and all this. And what does Noah do? He gets off the boat and gets inebriated. He gets off the boat and gets wasted. And what do the daughters do, or the sons do? We think about Ham and the exposing him, I should say. That's an interesting thing. So it's like, we all have these tendencies. Noah was traumatized. He escaped to alcohol. He went to flight. And so we can see these same type of reactions happening in the Bible. We've just got maybe more of a sophisticated language for it in the 21st century, or something that's a little more scientific sounding. But you can find this stuff in the Bible.
Absolutely. And remember, I said I was going to come back to the person that on the outside, everything looks great, right? They're eating good. They're eating whole foods. They're exercising. They're, checking the boxes as far as what a healthy lifestyle looks like. But for whatever reason, they're not well. And it's usually because they have what I call trapped trauma. It's trapped inside them, and it's preventing them from really healing because they're burying it. Even though everything looks here, it's not great. So that's where it goes back to this holistic approach to healing our bodies, which is why I loved doing what I do in a holistic approach, because there again, our bodies are not silos. They're not individual silos. And that's what doctors tend to do, right? You go to the doctor and you're like, oh, I have high blood pressure. I have high cholesterol. I have arthritis. So you usually walk out of the doctor's office with 3 prescriptions to treat those 3 things, when in reality, those prescriptions are going to give you major side effects, long-term health problems, because why? You're not healing yourself holistically. In trauma, you have to heal it holistically. You have to heal it spiritually, because God's the ultimate healer. We need him first and foremost. We have to heal it emotionally, and we have to heal it physically, and not look at it individually. That makes sense?
Yeah. So let's go ahead and listen to a couple of these statements from people just to say hi. Anna, hello. Well, hello back to you. I thank you, Gerald. This is a great session. We appreciate that. Yeshua, Messiah. Yes, Jesus is the Messiah. Right. I was a broken down meth head, and I was saved on November 1st, 1999, on a Monday night at Calvary, Costa Mesa, with Greg Laurie teaching. I'm an evangelist now, an elder, and I've been serving the Lord ever since. And I just want to say, praise God. I too came to Christ on a Monday night with Greg Laurie preaching at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. And it's just so encouraging to hear the amount of lives that have been changed and transformed. People who were living in utter trauma before Christ came in to heal those wounds. Why don't we talk about some solution stuff, huh? What do you think about that?
Yeah.
And then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, we have to talk about, so we've thrown it out there. We have trauma. If we don't, you're going to have it, right? So we really need to get to some solutions. Like, how can we heal our trauma? And ultimately, like we've said, God is the great physician, and he's going to ultimately bring that healing if we submit to him and do his ways. But sometimes this side of heaven, we have to do things to heal that trauma. So the thing with healing anything, right? Depression, anxiety, trauma, is it's not linear. It's not like, one size fits all. It's a very complex thing, healing trauma, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah.
So I think it's not like,
here's
this one thing you can do. It just doesn't work that way.
And do you feel like the church can often just minimalize it? Just say a little bit more prayer, just get over it, or, you spiritualize it, and it's deeper.
It is. It's so much deeper. It's so much it's so many layers. It's so textured. And it's just not easy, but there are some things that we can do to foster that. And one of the things is just know what's going on, just know what's going on in your body, be aware of it, because there again, knowledge is power. When we don't have the knowledge, we kind of just float through life uninformed and just let things happen to us. So just having that knowledge and having that power and having that awareness of what, for example, your survival style is. Are you a fighter? Are you a fleer? Or do you freeze? Like maybe your combination, being aware of how you process things when they do come at you. Having an awareness. I've heard this on a holistic psychologist podcast. Just, when I say know what's going on, meaning having that awareness of your thoughts, having that awareness of your emotions, being conscious about your behavior. And I think that's so important, just bringing that whole body awareness to the way that your life is approaching you and you're approaching life. So that's one thing. Another practical thing is just to be connected, stay connected. We need that support and we need community. And that is definitely 100% going to look different for different people, because some people may be like, I'm scared to death of people. People have hurt me. Your trauma came from people, which it usually does. So it's going to look different for you, right? But nonetheless, we need that community and we need that support. A friend of mine in North Carolina, she's like, I don't really need people. She was like, but I do know that I need to. I didn't agree with her. I do think we need people in community, but for her, it just looks different. For her, it means going out for a walk, connecting with nature, saying hi to the barista at the coffee shop, going and sitting in a church service. To her, that fills her cup. But for others, maybe if you haven't been so traumatized by people, you can get in a life group, you can get in a small group, you can get in a women's Bible study, a book club, something where you're getting that community and that support.
Yeah.
Another big thing is just healing your stress physiology. And what do I mean by that? It's like your stress physiology, meaning just healing your body, listening to your body, healing your gut and your brain, healing your nervous system, healing your adrenal glands, because that's where your cortisol and your adrenaline come from. And when you're traumatized, your cortisol levels are going up and down and up and down. You're not sleeping, you're stressed out. And a lot of people have adrenal fatigue, especially if you're mid 40s and above. I see a ton of women and men who are in constant adrenal fatigue.
Yeah.
And there's things you can take. There's supplementation that you can take. And I'll show you a few things here in a minute that you can do to help if you're in that. But being in tune with your body, that's what I mean when healing your stress physiology and healing your gut, because I can't let an hour go by without talking about the gut, because our gut feels the trauma. It just does. We have 25 to 35 feet in our digestive tract. From the time you put something in your mouth to the time it comes out, that's 25 feet. Think about that. So our gut is, did you know that?
That's a lot. I think you've told me that before.
I mean,
intestines.
Can we have a moment of this? Yeah, it's 25 feet. I mean, God's pretty amazing that he made 25 feet. I mean, that's crammed inside here. I mean,
it's like a water slide, right? It's just traveling down the water slide, waiting to exit.
Yeah, it is. So when you think about 25 feet, you have to realize that trauma is affecting that 25 feet. Trauma is affecting our gut. Our gut's called our second brain for a reason. And I always say this, it's really kind of like our first brain in terms of sensing, because it's interpreting everything around us. That 25 feet of gut is interpreting stress around us. It's interpreting how our relationships are. It's interpreting how our food is being processed. Are you eating when you're stressed out? Are you fasting? It's receiving all of that information, and then it's actually relaying it to the brain in your head. So healing your body, and you can do that through healing your gut, through proper supplementation, through
show some of those supplementations. I think that would be helpful. So this is
what I do. So I've done this in the past, and I've had several people reach out to me, but it's very important when you're talking about healing your body that you give it what it needs, because it's really almost impossible to heal your gut and your microbiome and giving it everything it needs with just food. Although food is always the first form of medicine. I think that's great, but you usually need an additional pick-me-up boost. And this is something that Bobby and I both take. You can text me or whatever, reach out to me on email or Instagram or Facebook, and I can tell you what it is. But basically, it's giving your body that boost with the probiotics and the prebiotics and the mentobiotics that help that brain-gut connection, that help everything flow well from your brain to your gut. And I think it's so important. And also, I'm
going to put your email in the comment for them right now, okay?
Oh, yeah. Do that. So it's really important to realize that sometimes your body needs that additional support. And so giving it what it needs to help heal that trauma, because when we're in trauma, our body wants to go to something to numb out, right? It wants that cupcake. It wants that bag of chips. It wants something to give yourself comfort. And in the long term, that's really not going to help. I mean, short term, yeah, it's like, hey, I got the cookie, I got the ice cream, I got the pizza, I feel good. But it's not helping you long term. And actually, it's doing more damage to your microbiome, more damage to your gut, which then in turn does more damage to your brain and your psyche. So it's just a vicious cycle, right? So it's that holistic approach of healing the brain and the gut and realizing that it is our second brain for a reason.
It can be overwhelming, can't it? When you think about I'm traumatized.
Give me a cupcake.
So pray. Yeah. Give me a cupcake. Pray, read your Bible, do a cleanse, take your probiotics, get your, all this in place. Make sure you check out, this pattern and this pattern. And I get it. It can be overwhelming. We're not trying to overwhelm you, but we are trying to say it isn't simple. It isn't simple. And if we simplify it, sometimes what it really is too, is it's one of these features that really come along and help.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. It isn't simple, but it is simple, because I think it's complex, the things that we have to do, but there are just a few things that you can do to really set yourself up to win and to feel better without overwhelming yourself. And you don't have to do everything cold turkey, but just realizing when you're talking about trauma, it's affecting your mind, your body, and your spirit. So right now we're talking about the body part of it. Let's heal our body. Let's start eating those whole foods. Let's give it the proper supplementation it needs to get our gut healthy, because in our gut, that's where we're producing, there again, those serotonin and the dopamine, which are our happy hormones, are produced right there in our gut. It's where we dial down our inflammation. It's where we modulate our immune system. All of this is going right into our gut. And so many people think, oh, our gut is just where we eat food. It's just where we put it in and it comes out. And that's not the case. So being very mindful of what you're putting in your body and just taking those simple steps one by one.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I've just been so thankful. There's a lot of layers sometimes, and it's part of what's got us passionate. You kind of start off the Christian faith, and, she's a nutritionist. She's passionate about nutrition stuff. We're new Christians. We're excited about the Lord. And we've seen just the blessing of that on our life. But then what happens is, as we go along, we start realizing, hey, all truth is God's truth. And if we can learn different remedies to help us in difficulty, that's great.
Yeah.
Gerald said this, all that and that people helping people is taboo. I guess maybe all that talk about people helping people is taboo is maybe what he was putting. A pernicious lie. Jesus educated you both to get me back on path. Well, here is something I'd say that hopefully is encouraging now. We are people helping you right now. So there is a sense where people do help us, but I think I know what you're saying. And it is true that sometimes it's like, what do you mean that people help us? Like, we need people, because if people don't know how to understand us, then we want to isolate. If people don't know how to be there for us, it can be overwhelming. If people are going to be more sharp and more hurtful, then how are they really helping? And I think that a certain kind of relational help is very healthy to us. And so, like, for example, when you read books, you're being helped by authors who are people. And so I would say it is so important that we realize that all kinds of people can help us, be it through their writings, through their podcasts, and in even the right kind of connection where people are there to help us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. And I just saw someone says you don't always have the ability to care about supplements during trauma. I didn't realize that for 2 weeks that I hadn't brushed my teeth. And you know what? You're so right, Amanda. Like, when you're traumatized, the last thing you want to think about is getting out of bed and brushing your teeth or swallowing a supplement, right? And so I totally validate that, because when you're traumatized, it's all you can do sometimes just to breathe in and breathe out. But when you do come to and you're like, okay, I don't want to live like this forever. How can I manage? How can I heal my mind? How can I heal my mind, my body, and my spirit? And then that's what we're talking about here is, giving it that supplementation, getting some therapy, getting into community or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And a couple more, this is a mood supplement that I swear by. And women, if you have PMS, hit me up for this one, because this is really good. He takes it. He doesn't have PMS, but he takes it too, because it just helps you when you're in stressful environments, or you have a long work day, or you're having a long day with the kids. It just kind of helps take the edge off. It doesn't make you feel high or anything like that. It just really gives you natural medicine to help you feel better and manage it. And then I talked a little bit about adrenals, and this is something I order on Amazon, actually. I don't know why I can never get these to show.
Here.
I don't know what it is, but this one's called Super Adrenal Stress Formula. And it's really good because it has a lot of natural vitamins in it. And because a lot of times when we're going through trauma, stress, depression, anxiety, our adrenals are fatigued and they're worn out, like I said before. So you want to give it those things that'll help it get back on track while you're tackling the mental health issues or whatever else could be coming along your way.
Good deal.
So those are those things. And then the fourth thing I think we can do to heal our trauma is to learn to feel the discomfort and the fears. So think about that for a second. You have to learn to feel the discomfort and the fears, because what do we usually want to do when we're traumatized? We want to numb out. We want to escape. Yeah. We want to go eat the pizza. We want to go have a glass of wine. We want to go do whatever, anything to not feel that pain and that discomfort. And so
That's where
often
even people start getting into cutting and things like that.
Yeah, it's very deep. And I think it's so important that we realize, okay, when we're trying to numb out, but often the very things that we're trying to numb out from, those traumatic, scary life experiences that come out our way, those traumatic experiences are the very same things that we actually need to feel and that we need to sit with and that we need to let that rise up so that we can get it to the surface. So it's not trapped. And that's what I mean by that trapped trauma. You got to let it come up. You have to let your body feel that. You have to let your mind feel that and process it. And sometimes you need help doing that. You need a therapist to help you, or a holistic nutritionist to help you, a friend to help you. You need someone to help you, because sometimes it's very, very hard to really stay that course and to feel what's going on, to, feel your emotions, feel what's coming and going in and out of your body.
It made me think of Brene Brown. We heard her being interviewed recently, and she said, comfort is overrated.
Yeah.
And I thought,
right.
My goodness, is it really
right.
overrated? Because I want to be comforted, right? I want peace. I want shalom. But I think it's overrated in that if we don't address our discomforts, then we're not going to grow, and we're going to be paralyzed, and we're going to have unprocessed trauma, and so on and so forth. So
it traps it down. That's exactly what she's talking about. Like, we value that numbing out feeling, that comfort feeling, right? When in reality, we just need to face it. And because when we do trap it and force it, we're damaging our brain, we're damaging our immune system, we're damaging our hormones, and all of these things need to be faced so that we can be whole the way that God intended us to be.
Yeah.
And the last thing, and this is a good one too. The last thing I think we have to do to heal our trauma is we have to start building capacity. And that really makes sense, but building capacity, and usually you're like, well, how do I do that? Well, typically when you're doing the 1 through 4, the last 4 I just talked about, you'll start gaining health, right? You'll be like, okay, I've let these things resurface. I've started taking care of myself physically. I'm giving my body what it wants nutritionally. I'm building community. I'm doing these, checking the boxes 1, 2, 3, and 4. So now your capacity is building, right? So now you're going to be able to process the trauma better when it comes in. And the more trauma you've had in your life, this is a pretty important thing. I even wrote it down. The more trauma we've experienced in our life, the more effort we have to put into our self-care and into our self-practices and learning to heal ourselves, to undo the damage of trauma so that we can rewire our brains, rewire our body, and rewire our behavior. Because it's cumulative, like I said. So the more you've had, the more intentional you have to be. So I think when you put all of these pieces together, it's not a magic bullet, right? Healing is not linear, but it's cumulative, and you start building capacity. And before you know it, you're like, wow, I've really done the work. I've really done what I've needed to do these past few years. I'm taking care of myself emotionally, physically. I'm doing all these things. And then, wow, I'm actually a different person. So, just baby steps. So wherever you are, just start where you are. And then you'll find a year from now, 6 months from now, that you're actually going to be in a better place.
Yeah, it's pretty encouraging when you think about it. I mean, I like the statement building capacity because, as the individuals just said a bit ago, I couldn't brush my teeth for 2 weeks. Like, there was just no capacity for the smallest things. And so depending upon the depth of one's trauma, the smallest of tasks, the brushing of teeth, the taking out of trash, the making of your bed, the, washing your car, the paying the bills, and especially bills and stuff like that. Like, if you're right brain creative type, administrative tasks can just be so overwhelming in the midst of trauma, right? Like paying bills and doing government forms, shoot me now, right? But what happens is we get healthier. To Heather's point, our capacity grows. I would say that one thing that we could also do is life goes on even though we're traumatized, and we have to go on as well. And what happens is if we don't deal with the daily necessities, when you get behind on life, we're just stacking our trauma and we're getting overwhelmed. It's almost like trauma has a weight, and that weight needs to be lifted. But when we don't address the things that we can do, then we're stacking the weight, and it's getting heavier and smothering us and overwhelming us. And it makes it hard for us to imagine doing anything. And so just kind of anything that we can do to knock out those things, because what happens is there can be simple tasks in our life that while we're traumatized, not only are we not addressing our trauma, we're not addressing life. And life's coming at us. And if we don't deal with those simple tasks in life, we're going to just get extra paralyzed and get extra overwhelmed and get more and more unhealthy. And so one way to deal with our trauma the best we can is when we have those energy moments, realize, hey, all I'm doing is thinking about paying the bills anyway, and it's just eating at me. Let me just get it over with. Like, it's called the do it now principle. It's been said before in leadership. Just do it now, get it over with. Do that simple task, or budget 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there to deal with different things so that you can become less overwhelmed, so you can give your mental energy to what you really want to fight for.
Yeah. And when you were speaking, that also reminds me, be a good steward, be a good guardian of your energy and where you allocate your time, especially when you are dealing with trauma. So when you're dealing with a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of trauma, just be mindful. We tend to spread ourselves way too thin. We don't think about what we're doing. We don't think about who we're meeting with. We don't think about we're just on automatic pilot. But be intentional about, in this season of life, this is where I'm going to allocate my time and my resources. And then you will build capacity as you start healing. And then you can give yourself to more people and more time. But having very strong boundaries is key. And setting up good routines and habits. And we've kind of hit on some of that, but I think all of that is so key in dealing with yourself, especially if you're in the middle of a traumatic experience.
So here we are. We've been talking about healing trauma. I mentioned I put Heather's email up. There it is. If you are in need of nutrition counseling or any type of life coaching or counsel, just reach out to Heather. She can chat with you about that. If you needed any questions on some of the supplements that help, you can reach out to her as well. We do want you to know that we're hoping to put together a crash course on mental health that we would videotape together. We have 6 to maybe 8 sessions, and it would be included with small group discussion questions. So this could be something that an individual could go through, or if you're a small group leader, because we really want to get out in front. The church has a mental health crisis on its hands, and that's why we're speaking out. And so as an apologist, you go, how does that fit in there? What is one apologist dealing with mental health? Because I believe that mental health issues isn't one of the main apologetic issues of our day. We've got to figure out how to deal with it. We have a mental health crisis. People are suffering, people are struggling, and the church's solution is often like the parable of the Good Samaritan, what Jesus tells. And, if you want to say it's parable, we don't have time to get into that at the moment. But, here, what's happening, the religious people, they just pass by. They just keep on going. They ignore it. And there's trauma there. And listen, we live in a world filled with trauma, and the church can't just pass by. While I'm thankful that, that the Samaritan, the world, so to speak, is offering some solutions, is offering some help to tackle our traumas. The church, the religious folks, right? Those who believe in Jesus, and I'm using religion in a good way there. Hopefully you get my point. We need to be part of the solution. Yeah. So we hope to put together a course on that can really begin to help you. So keep your eyes and ears open. We're probably looking to develop that in about 2 to 3 months from now. And so hopefully that'll release in the next 3 to 4 months, but it would be a full-on small group curriculum. Really want to start educating the local church. I do want to say that if you're looking for somebody to jump aboard, Heather and I, we're looking for supporters. And if you'd be interested in jumping on our team, that would be great. I know that asking for help in a time like this, you're like, hey, welcome to the club. And if that's the case, we get it. We realize, though, some people are blessed and are able to go through a difficult season like this. And they have resources still. And if you're looking for a ministry to support, we would love that. Our goal, we were taking half of our pay was coming through Woman and Apologist. And we have not been able to pay ourselves for the last 3 months because of this crisis. And so we've put that on pause. And neither have we been able to pay our executive producer because we're trying to navigate our way through this. And we're hoping that we can see that come back into place. So we're just asking if you're in a position to be a monthly supporter or if you're able to give a one-time gift. If you want to ask us questions, feel free to Facebook, and we're happy to talk about that. But we would love for you to join our team, our support family, because this is a 501c3 and we can't do it without the help of people who believe in what we do. I'm thankful we've given over 1,000 videos, basically, free of charge. There's been thousands upon thousands of hours of work that's went into this ministry, and we want to keep it up. We got a lot of exciting vision to come. I do want to say, some of our upcoming guests, Jay Warner Wallace will be on with me next week. Some of you might know him. He's written a lot of great stuff for God's Crime Scene, and he's just a sharp guy, detective. He's been all over the news on Dateline, and we're going to be talking about a cop's perspective of all that's going on in our culture. Nancy Piercy, worldview scholar, expert. She will be my guest coming up in a few weeks as well. And we have other great guests coming your way. Final thoughts before we open it up for questions?
No, yeah, I was going to say, just in terms of giving, I know for Bobby and I, so often people are like, oh, they get bombarded by being asked to give. But, through the years, sometimes any amount matters. I mean, there's been a time when we were supporting World Vision where we only gave like $20 a month, but we did that consistently for years.
Yeah.
So, don't feel like, oh, I don't have anything to give. I mean, we appreciate just a monthly donation. If you're watching, $10 a month is great, $15 a month, because all of that adds up. And,
it does.
And it makes a big difference to the ministry because it is a 501c3. So even if it's just a monthly donation of $10, $15, that goes a long way. So that's that. And I saw one question over here I wanted to answer. Oh, wait, here we go. Anna.
Okay.
Oh, okay. It says, wonderful. What's it say? You can read it.
Wonderful thoughts. In your holistic approach, where would you fit in the secular versus Christian biblical counseling view, in addition to taking care of the gut-mind connection?
Okay. Okay. So basically, what I would say to that, if I'm reading it correctly, is all truth is God's truth. And he's the one that's created our body. He's the one that's created the gut-mind connection. So, I don't really separate it from secular to biblical. I know a lot of Christians, they do that, right? They think it's just a one size
like
fits all.
nouthetic counseling, right? When the Adams family of discussion, nouthetic counseling would just be utilizing scripture. Scripture alone could have all the answers. And I'd say that we look to the scripture. That's our primary authority as believers, but then more of an overlap, integrative approach, whereby, yes, we would be very open to all truth is God's truth.
Yeah, I don't think it contradicts at all, not even a little bit, because at the end of the day, God created our bodies and that comes from him. So I would think he would give us tools this side of heaven to heal ourselves. And I don't think it's either or, but that's a good question.
Yeah, so we're definitely like, it's kind of like, what does science tell us? Like the two books, the book of special revelation and the book of natural revelation, right? Like, it's kind of like we've got this two books. We've got stuff in creation that we can learn, and then we've got the scripture. If I was to apply it kind of into a clinical sense, like we're thankful for neuroscience, we're thankful for psychology, but we use the scripture to guard against it, right? So if we're talking about language and we go, man, this just seems really bizarre, there's no way that this even fits in the scripture. Okay, well, then we need to make sure that we're discerning, right? If the Bible talks about, like, so even in Buddhism, for example, breathing, what's wrong with some good breathing? That's good. But if you believe that you're trying to just empty your brain, then we would say we need to guard our mind,
right?
And so that's a difference. And so, and by the way, the brain and the mind That can be confusing for people sometimes because the brain is, your gray matter, right? The mind is not the brain. So that would be another area where we would be distinct. You would have people that are be more like, atheists, that they would not distinguish between the mind and the brain, right? Because we're complete matter. We're all physical. But we would say that we are dualists, that we believe that we are material and immaterial. And so there's a connection in the way that the mind works in conjunction with the brain. Okay, let's see if we have any other questions. Oh, look at there. Hey, Carrie. Good to see you, bud. Thanks for jumping on. I used to be Carrie's pastor back in North Carolina. We miss you too, bud.
Yeah.
Gerald asks, what is a midlife crisis in reality? Here's something that takes place. And there's a reason why I think it happens to people a lot in their 40s. You get married maybe in your 20s. You've gotten out of college. You start your career, and you're filled with dreams and vision, and you're thinking about how your marriage is going to be, and you're thinking about how great it's going to have kids, and you're thinking of how great your career is going to be. Well, what happens is you kind of get into your 40s, and maybe you're about to empty nest your kids, and you start asking yourself questions like, does my marriage have what it takes to go the long haul? People start thinking, I'm kind of getting ready to get old here. Maybe I just kind of need to jump ships here while there's still a chance for me to find somebody and enjoy a family again and get a second crack at this, because people feel overwhelmed with guilt and the way they did it in their first time around. Their job is maybe not feeling as fulfilling as they thought it would be. They're feeling empty, and they're asking questions like, man, was it worth it? I put all this time and effort into this career and I hate it. I put all this time and effort into this relationship and we feel so far apart. Put all this time and effort into parenting my kids and I feel like we're struggling. And what ends up happening is people start asking these questions, and then they can start getting traumatized, right, by the thought of living another 40 years in the state that they're in. But there's other things that can add to it outside of just, hey, some of the things that I thought were going to work one way are working another, and therefore I'm disillusioned. Therefore I'm in a midlife crisis. There's other things. The body. Think about people. They start taking high blood pressure medicine as they get older because the heart's not pumping as well. But even the brain, people end up on antidepressants. Why? Because they're not getting the endorphins and the serotonin, and they're struggling to produce the chemicals that they once did when they were younger, because the brain is getting older and it's getting worn down, and that starts playing on the moods. And so all of that coming together can really be a recipe for a midlife crisis. And that's why another thing, the church has to figure out a way to let people know how to navigate their way through the different seasons of life. Like, hey, you're about to graduate from high school. These are the questions that I know you're asking right now. These are the ways that you need to be prepared to go meet the world. Oh, you're getting married. You're about to start a family. These are the questions you have. These are the things you're going to be up against. Oh, you're about to empty nest your children. You're about to become grandparents. You're in this season of life. And so there's different ways that we need to offer people wisdom for their particular season of life. And it's not this sweeping, simplistic answer always. I think that is one of the reasons. So you got to renegotiate your life stance, so to speak, in this midlife crisis and go, okay, what can I learn from this? Like Heather and I, we've been very open and real. Like we've known lots of difficult times in our marriage. We spoke about it while we've traveled on the road. We've known difficult times in parenting, but we've talked through that, and we've tried to be open and we try to be real, and then we start sharing with others. We go, wow, we're not alone. Like, she's not the only one that's married to a crazy dude, right? And so we start finding comfort in that, and we start realizing that if we can just talk and be open and go, we're all just trying to be faithful to the end. And if we try to do it alone, and if we're not open and real, it's going to get exhausting. Hannah, how can I be part of monthly support? Well, first off, thank you so much for your willingness to even be a part of monthly support. I did put a link right there. We're looking for different Patreon people to be on our team at patreon.com. If you go there, you can plug in a number. If you'll just put that site in and jump aboard our support team, that would be great. That's very sweet of you. That means a lot. I can tell you this, my wife and I, we love helping, and we want to build a relationship with our YouTube audience. We're humbled to be able to have people that will listen to what we're sharing, and we want to be of service. And so thank you for your help. That means a lot. Let me check out and see if there's some other questions before we tap out here. Carrie, maybe I missed it, but what are some ways to come alongside a friend that's having difficulty processing trauma in life without causing additional stress on them? No, I think Heather, why don't you answer that, sweetie? I mean, we've talked about how to deal with your own trauma, but how do you be there for somebody who is traumatized? Why don't you speak, and then I'll just kind of fill in.
Yeah, well, I mean, there again, there's not a one size fits all, but I think when someone's in trauma, you let them lead that, right? Like letting them know, hey, I am here for you, and I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to come alongside, do whatever you need, maybe bring you a meal, listen to you, have a cup of coffee with you, whatever it is, let them lead the way. Even if they're pushing you out, still reach out with that text, tell them you're there, because when you're being traumatized and you're under so much stress, sometimes people cope differently, right? Some people shut down. Some people hide, some people fight. So just really taking the cues from them and not taking anything personal. Because I know when I've been in trauma, I've even walked people through trauma.
Lashing out can happen.
Yeah, they can lash out, and you just can't take it personal and just be there for them. That's the best thing you can do to be a good friend, and just being consistent, being that good, loyal, true friend, as I know you will be.
Yeah, after I had my relapse, Carrie, that you're definitely familiar with, as I was your pastor, and I can tell you. You're traumatized after that. I mean, 23 years without a drink, and how in the world, why did I do this? And why did I have a drink? And then you start exploring and getting beneath things, and oh man, life just gets overwhelming. And I was so thankful for our mother church, Bill Wellens, and he was a mentor of mine, and he came alongside of me in the midst of my trauma, in that painful moment, and he said, Bobby, I want to join you in your journey, not judge you in it. And wow, my guards just dropped, because
yeah,
as you know, I mean, people can be so judgmental on something like that. Like, how compassionate, how gracious. I want to join you, and I want to come alongside of you. I want to help you. And so maybe just telling your friend that, listen, I want to join you in your journey, not judge you in it. And then also even just, I think it's helpful sometimes to tell somebody that's traumatized, hey, I realize that I fear that I could say the wrong thing or not say something. I'm just hesitant, and I really want you to know that I want to be there for you. Let me know what the best way I can be there for you is, because I know when you're hurting, trust can be broken down, and we look at things through kind of a jaded lens here. And I just want you to know, I want to be a trustworthy friend, and whatever I can do to do that, let me know how I can help in that way. I think that can be really important because it's like this whole race issue that's coming up. I was just talking on the radio a little bit before I came over here, and we were talking about the culture and the statues that are being pulled down. And obviously our culture is traumatized, and we're watching the news and going, what's going on? And as I was answering the question, I found myself saying live on the radio, going, even as I'm answering this question, I can just imagine that no matter how I answer this, I could frustrate some people. And I want you to know that's not my intent. I'm on my inside scrambling, trying to give an answer on the spot, but I hope that I come across in the right way here. And you know what I think that does? It just diffuses things. So thank you for your question, bro. And I hope that our reply helps. Let's see here. I'm sorry I asked about midlife crisis while you were talking about supplements. It's the supplement is supplements to help. He's very sad. Okay.
What's left us of it? Okay, so yeah, I mean, there again, there's not like a magic bullet, but it goes back to giving your body what it needs. And when we're in a midlife crisis, it could be a hormone issue, it could be trauma, it could be stress. Who knows why people do what they do? But yes, there are definitely things that you can take that will, heal your body, guard your body, give it that extra upper hand to heal. And if you want to email me or reach out, I would be happy to share. Like I did, there's these mentobiotics that are really good for your gut health, that heal your gut, which then again heals your brain, because all of the hormones are produced in our gut that go straight to our brain. And when those are off, you start acting wacky. When your hormones are out of whack, they're out of whack, and you start acting weird for a reason. So yes, there are definitely things. There's mood supplements, there's adrenal things you can take. And these are all natural things that come from the earth, that come from Ayurvedic medicine, and it's not a medication that's going to give you horrible side effects. So I would love to help you in any of that. So reach out. I'd be happy to help.
Kevin, I'll answer this as our last question, just because I know time is, we've been on for a while, but it says, hi, Bobby and Heather. Here in Latin America, people are clearly traumatized, and we have these struggles. In this COVID-19, so much that people are committing suicide. Depression is getting, specifically targeting teenagers. What advice would you give to this generation in this particular time? What would you say? And then I'll just close this up.
Go ahead. That's a good one.
She says,
I have things to say, but go ahead. Yeah.
Well, you're not alone
Yeah.
in Latin America. We feel it here as well, Kevin. The tension is really great. Now, I'm sure you're aware of the news. We've got the COVID-19 stuff that we share in common across the world, but you can also see some of the political stuff that's taking place where our nation is really split right now. And so that's adding another layer of challenge. And so you're exactly right. There are more suicides. The depression is up. And this is why we have to figure out what are we going to do to help in such a time as this. I think that the advice that I could give to this generation in this time is, for the church, we need to remember that nothing is going to stop God from fulfilling his ultimate purpose. And so in these tumultuous times, it's a time for us to be reminded of all that we have to be thankful for, that we have God to latch onto, that he is our Savior, that one day he will be in charge of our heavenly government as our governor. We will have perfect relational peace. Our bodies aren't going to be prone to trauma and decay. That'll be perfect. And so I think it does help for us to live now with the end in mind as a perspective. I do think, as it relates to some of the crisis that's here, the church needs to step up and be a voice of hope. We need to give hope no matter how dark it gets. We need to realize that Paul was living in a time where he's talking about submitting to governing authorities in Romans chapter 13. Well, who was the governing authority in Rome? Nero. Well, who was the one that decapitated Paul? Nero. So he was living in some tumultuous times. He understood what it was like to live in the Greco-Roman world, in a culture that was filled with moral relativism, pluralism, sexual debauchery. It was all there. He knew what it was like to see the church being absolutely persecuted. So we live in a time where we go, man, it feels like the church is being persecuted. There's moral debauchery. There's secularism. There's pluralism. And all of this creates this whole plethora of issues for us. But what can we learn from Paul? To live as Christ is to die as gain. He kept on keeping on. He kept his hope in Christ. And so now's not the time to give up on the church. Now's the time to lean into it more than ever. Now's not the time to get disillusioned with God. Now's the time to delight in God more than ever. Now's not the time to quit reading the Word. Now's the time to get into the Word and ask God to give us a worldview for how to navigate people forward. And so the kind of worldview that you'll apply the gospel to in Latin America is different than what we will need here in America. The gospel's not The gospel doesn't change, but the way we apply it in the culture that we live in does. And that requires being aware of the issues we face. So I would say encouraging churches to be aware of the importance of mental health ministry, valuing your counselors in your culture, seeing churches plant counseling centers. If a church can't plant a counseling center, strategically working with other churches, where you create a pool fund whereby you create one local clinic that is sourced by several local churches that will not only pay for people to go off and get counseling training, but then will make sure that that's in place. So, I mean, there's so much that we can do. I would just say the biggest thing is don't lose hope.
Well said.
All right. Well, thanks, babe. And everybody, thank you so much. John P. Hi, Bobby. I love your accessibility and help through live streams. Keep up the great work and all that you do. Thank you so much, John. It means a lot. We really appreciate the super chat. And Tisha and Gerald and Michael the Prince and Carrie and Andrew and Anna and going through here and Hannah. You guys, we loved having you on the program, and Yeshua Messiah and Amanda, all of you, Darren, we see you here. You matter, and we're so thankful that you're there. Mom, hello. Check that out. There's my mom. Hi, Bobby and Heather. Check that out. And Lisa, she puts chocolate. Amen. Don't know what spawned that.
Always the right answer.
That's always the right answer. And Curtis, all of you guys, Amanda, just thank you guys so much for being on the program. And listen, subscribe to our podcast as well. Tim Ho, our executive producer at 1 Minute Apologist, he puts out stuff. So we take these live feeds that we do, and then he'll take this stuff and break it up and put it into podcasts. And so it's another way to access our information. Well, I wish you all the best. God bless you, and peace out.
Bye.